For Spence.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A few years ago, the Prime Minister, the Treasurer, the Minister for Finance, the Minister for Health, the Minister for Home Affairs and the Minister for Industry, Science, Energy and Resources walk into a bar. He orders a drink. As much as that is a joke, at its crux it was certainly no laughing matter, though it turned our relatively young democracy into a laughingstock in front of an international audience. And that conduct turned our institutions of executive government into a laughingstock to the public at large. It also showed just how close we, as a country, can get to being in a state of constitutional crisis, when those entrusted with the highest offices in our land do not follow established practices or conventions. Speaker, it is indeed true that the events that caused us to need to enact this legislation occurred prior to my election to this place. But it certainly has allowed me to see this through the lens of how I'd have reacted as a private citizen had I, along with the rest of the public, known what the member for Cook had done in the years or months prior to last year's election. As a member of this place and of the legislative branch of government, I, along with all members of this place, shoulder a great duty and responsibility to foster public trust in this institution, but due to the actions of the member for Cook, we do so at a position of weakness. And this begins to form the basis as to why I rise today to speak in support of the Ministers of State Amendment Bill 2022. This is not what formed an explicit election commitment, as the circumstances that brought this about had only come to light publicly and through investigations conducted by our Solicitor General, Dr Stephen Donohue, KC. The advice provided to government and subsequently made public, which led to another review, conducted by former High Court Justice the Honourable Virginia Bell, AC, the inquiry into the appointment of the former Prime Minister to administer multiple departments. As a result of these thorough investigations, the fact that brought us here are thankfully quite settled and established. They ultimately revolve around the actions of the member for Cook. The member for Cook, between 2020 and 2021, when he was Prime Minister, was secretly appointed by the Governor-General to administer multiple portfolios or departments of state. The portfolios or departments of state in question I had alluded to in my opening remarks. They were Treasury, Finance, Home Affairs, Health and Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. It would shock nobody to know that, at the time the appointments were made, there was no cause for the ministers that were publicly listed as such to need to be replaced with an acting minister. Whether it be on health grounds or any other number of reasons that could cause a minister to temporarily relinquish their powers or to be required to stand aside from exercising their powers as a Minister of State. In my research of this bill, I also took note of the explanatory memorandum that was provided alongside this bill. I can see that there is no financial impact as a result of this bill passing. Therefore, it would have cost the member for Cook's former government $0 to safeguard responsible government, yet the member for Cook chose secrecy instead. Secrecy was definitely the MO of the previous government, but you'd never have speculated that would be the case in such a profound way, to the very machinery of how their government operated. Secrecy itself has its own cost, some of them intangible, such as the damage caused to the reputation of Australia's government, to our democracy. Despite these events, I feel that Australians can pride itself on its democracy, one of compulsory voting, with an independent electoral commission both federally and in our states and territories. In some respects, is very robust, taking pages out of the Westminster system and that of the Washington system, but I digress, and I will soon sound like a civics teacher. The fact that the executive sits within our parliament, the legislature, is important. It means that we have the ability to access executive government, to ask questions of them and to hold them to account. this place sets aside time out of every sitting day to exemplify this. Question time. Some may refer to it as a political theatre, but it is an extremely important part of our democracy, the part that is underpinned by the principle of responsible government. A member of this place can stand up during question time and ask a question of a Minister of State concerning a matter involving a policy or a function of the department the minister has the powers and functions to administer. But how would a member direct the question to the right minister if some of the ministerial appointments had been made in secret to the parliament, to the public and even to the members of the Cabinet itself? The Solicitor-General, Stephen Donohue KC, noted in the advice he provided to the government on this matter to say that it is impossible for the parliament to hold ministers to account for the administration of departments if it does not know which ministers are responsible for which department. Speaker, the Albanese Labor government was elected with a mandate to restore public trust into the institutions of government and government itself. The cornerstone of this would be the establishment of the National Anti-Corruption Commission, which passed through the parliament late last year. The Ministers of State Amendment Bill 2022 follows the same core principles that underpinned the establishment of the National Anti-Corruption Commission, but there was no election commitment to enact this legislation. One might ask why that is. The legislation was a degree reactionary, as the catalyst for this legislation was only uncovered after election day. Speaker, I can only begin to speculate what would have happened had the conduct of the member for Cook entered the public domain prior to election day. I'm sure some out there would have put on a more full-blooded defence or more strenuously expressed that there is nothing to see here. I wonder whether we would have heard similar comments from the member for Macpherson, calling the conduct of the member for Cook unacceptable, calling for the member for Cook to resign, to leave the parliament, to then say she felt that the member for Cook's conduct was a betrayal of the Australian people. You can't get much more unequivocal than that. Would we have had the former Prime Minister Tony Abbott call the member for Cook's conduct highly unorthodox and that it shouldn't have happened? The member for Cook's conduct also received heavy condemnation from former Prime Minister John Howard, though the comments were akin to "I don't think he should have done that." That translates to significant criticism when it's been levelled at his own side of politics. As the comments of former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, to be fair, he's said worse about the member for Cook both publicly and privately, but equally it received his condemnation just the same, calling the member for Cook's actions sinister stuff, secret government and one of the most appalling things he has ever heard in our federal government. You could definitely tell he was holding back, which comes as a surprise to no one. Speaker, the bill itself is rather simple in its design, but crucially it would have prevented the situation where the member for Cook was sworn in secretly to administer several departments beyond Prime Minister and Cabinet, even without the knowledge of the ministers that serve concurrently in those portfolios, meaning the member for Cook was serving as a parallel minister to a Department of State. Not a shadow minister, but a minister in the shadows. The bill itself seeks to amend the Ministers of State Act 1952. The amendments to the Act would require the official secretary to the Governor-General to publish a notifiable instrument on the Federal Register of Legislation, which will advise of when the Governor-General has sworn in an Executive Councillor to the Federal Executive Council, or in layman's terms, when a minister has been sworn in to administer a Department of State, or when they have been directed to do so in whatever capacity that has been prescribed, or when an appointment of the nature I've just described has been revoked. This would appear to be largely uncontroversial on its face value, unlike the circumstances that required us to bring about codifying these conventions that had served us well for decades. Speaker, throughout the time between today and when the revelations about the member for Cook's multiple ministries came to light, one of the most lamentable moments had been as a result of the defence put in place to deflect or at times mitigate the gravity and severity of what his actions meant to our democracy, to our system of government. I am, however, going to skip over the defence pro-offered by the member for Cook himself in this chamber and in the media, as many parts of it are nonsense. To say that he would have revealed the truth had someone asked him is, suffice to say, a little rich for my taste. Putting the member for Cook's words to one side, we have seen a number of arguments being made by a member of the opposition, senior or otherwise, and by a number of sympathetic members of the commentariat. The arguments being made have been relatively similar. The main argument being made in defence, perhaps at times not directly of the member for Cook himself, but that getting to the bottom of this issue is not one that everyday voter would care about, not a bread and butter issue. I don't know whether these are just vestiges of a defeatist attitude or one that is running a beleaguered defence of the member for Cook, but this needs to be something that the average voter cares about, because if it isn't now, it once was. Sometimes apathy is worse than red-hot anger, for it proves a disconnect, a certain acquiescence of this sort of conduct. It breeds comments that many of us have heard all before. Politicians are all the same. We should, to an extent, for this very debate be all the same. We should want the Australian voter to view us better than what they do, regardless of how they do so at any given time. To say that the trustworthiness of the holder of the office of Prime Minister is not something that is relevant to the everyday voter is either laughable or upsetting to our profession if it were to be true. The other argument being put is that the line in the sand should be drawn, and as these are matters of the past, we should all move on. It is almost as if we are talking about actions taken during ancient history, as if relics from the secret ministry scandal are now held by the British Museum. But as a jolt of reality, these actions took place within the past 2 years, and the truth of what took place came out for public consumption roughly half a year ago. Even in the age of the 24-hour media cycle, this is recent enough to warrant investigation, to warrant the government to seek expert advice on how to rectify how it operates to prevent this from happening ever again. Speaker, as the paraphrase saying goes, we are doomed to repeat history, contemporary or otherwise, if we do not learn from it. It's not a mistake I or the Albanese Labor government is willing to make. It is my hope, and I'm sure the hopes of all members present, that this bill, when passed, will help to close one of the final loops of this sorry saga, and we can move on from this as a parliament, as a nation. Lastly, I could note many contributions in this place on the Ministers of State Amendment Bill 2022, but I would like to take particular note of the brief contribution made by the member for Hume. That very succinct statement made on this bill gives me a bit of hope. It is indeed my hope that, although I did not hear a full-throated support of the bill, I did hear it. A bit lukewarm, but it was supportive nevertheless. Just like with the establishment of the National Anti-Corruption Commission, the public will see a new page turned by our democratic institutions with the support of all sides of politics, particularly the support of the two parties of government. I would encourage all members of this place to support this bill and put one further step forward to restoring public confidence in government. For with the passage of this bill, the chapter we move on from cannot be repeated. And I thank the House.
The question is that this bill be now read